Serious, what's the family secret you're not supposed to know about? My cousin was born with severe physical disabilities. Turns out when I was a kid, early 80s, I had the chicken pox. My mom told all the family and made sure to tell my uncle and aunt as she was pregnant and shouldn't be around the pox. They came to visit anyway. My chicken pox became my pregnant aunt's chicken pox, which became my cousin's serious physical birth defects. My great-grandparents were very poor in Missouri back in the 1940s and 50s. They had 11 kids. Apparently, my great-grandfather would make my grandmother and great-aunt sleep with his friends for money. My great-grandmother allowed it to happen. Because of this, none of the older female children of my great-grandparents would refer to them as mom or dad. It was strictly on a first-name basis. Found out one night that my mom planned to leave my abusive dad when I was super little. He was beating us all, making her work 3 jobs to pay the bills and his drug habit. Just a bad time. My mom went to her sister and told her what my dad was doing to her and asked for help leaving. My aunt's reply: "I don't believe you." My mom stayed another 10 years because of this. Her own sister hearing about all the abuse and dismissing it really fucked with my mom mentally. My mom didn't want us to know so we would still have a good relationship with our aunt. My grandpa was married pretty early in his life. Soon into his marriage, my grandpa was having children with both my grandma and his wife. My grandma and his wife were sisters. They each had about 4 children with him before his wife passed away in a car accident and he married my grandma and joined the families together. I've got multiple aunts and uncles that are born in the same year. Not really sure how true this is, but my mom's half-sibling says one time my grandma and her family came to visit when he was about 14. My uncle said that my grandma's sister pulled him aside and told him to hide all the guns and knives in the house. He didn't ask why, so we don't really know why. Maybe she was afraid she'd kill her husband? Added extra story I forgot about. My great-grandfather ran some racket selling stolen coal and hid the money by buying land and part of a hotel in Florida. They found out after he died when the other hotel owners wanted to buy out my great-grandmother's share of the hotel. She ended up with the whole hotel and then sold it and the land a few years later. How she did it still isn't known because the kids didn't know anything about it until she died. My grandma's best friend slept with my granddad, her then husband, 30 years ago. Yes, they are still friends. My grandfather sold my aunt, severely schizophrenic, for marriage to a guy who wanted citizenship. My grandmother told me on her deathbed that my dad has a daughter from another woman. My aunt robbed the bank she used to work for. She then had to sell her apartment to pay the money back. This same aunt was caught cheating her husband in the same bank. She is from a small town, so it was a scandal. The funny thing is that she is the last person you would suspect to do those things, but she did. My great-grandmother did a few years in jail for bootlegging, and my grandfather, 12 at the time, had to raise his 3 younger sisters until she got out. I'm not supposed to know that the father I grew up with was not my biological father. My sister, in a vindictive moment, spilled the beans and I was sad for about a week, but it hasn't troubled me since then. I had a great father for 23 years, which is more than some people can say. My grandfather raped my grandmother in a chicken yard. She got pregnant and the parents of both forced them to get married. Later they had 8 children. My father and mother have been separated as long as I can remember. My grandmother told me that at the time of my birth, my father was sleeping around. I have the features of both parents, but that lets me know that I was definitely just one last one-night stand before things ended for good. My parents divorced 2 weeks after I was born. I found out later that they had separated before I was conceived, but my father took my mother to bed just to prove he could. So, I'm a product of matrimonial rape. He died when I was a toddler, so I'll never hear his side of the story. I have a half-sibling 8 months younger than me, so it's pretty clear he wasn't particularly moral in his behavior. My dad was paying child support to somebody that nobody knows. Found out only after he died. In my family I'm one of 6 girl cousins that are about the same age. One other is my sister. A relatively distant family member has sexually assaulted at least 4 of us 6, all before the age of 5. Brutally too. Like enough that they had cuts and bruises all over them. My uncle got super drunk one day and told me about it. 3 of the girls went through therapy, but he's not sure they remember. One repressed it immediately, and as far as anyone knows she has no idea it ever happened. Everyone has kinda just swept it under the rug, and it's just the thing that doesn't get talked about. To this day my mom refuses to tell me if I was also assaulted. She has also threatened anyone else that knows into not telling me. Although honestly I don't think she even knows. She tried to make sure I was never alone with him at all, so maybe not. The only one of the 6 I know that was never harmed is my sister, since we had moved away by the time she was born. Honestly, just be aware that repressed memories can emerge at any time. I was assaulted by a doctor as a preteen and only remembered it after reading an interview with the US gymnasts about their situation. I was reading about it on my phone in the airport with my now husband, and suddenly it all hit me. I went silent and pale. Couldn't even tell my so why for like a month. I honestly wish sometimes the memory never was triggered. It now feels like something I should deal with, as it does weigh on me and affect me from time to time. Most of my family knows that my grandfather refused several medals for his service in the Marines during World War II and became an agnostic liberal vegetarian after the war. What they don't know is that it was because he was a part of the human meat grinder in the Pacific that pushed from island to island towards Japan, and he had to kill several people. I know he was a part of the Solomon Islands campaign and fought at Guadalcanal. Then not sure which path he was on, but ended up at Okinawa where he was when the war ended. He only opened up to me about this much later in life, and he told me about 2 of the incidents where he had to kill someone, but alluded to there being more of them. I didn't get the impression that the 2 he told me about were chosen because they were the worst. They were some of the stories he told me about over the course of decades, where every retelling added more detail. He was one of the most honest, true to their word people I have ever known, and not prone at all to telling tall tales. I haven't told much of the rest of the family because he didn't want to be considered a war hero, and there are parts of the family that would twist it into him being one. My uncle and aunt's death was not carbon monoxide poisoning. It was a murder-suicide. Step family. The reason my aunt is never at the family gatherings is because my grandpa molested her, and when she told everyone, the entire family turned against her. Not because they didn't believe her, but because she was going to ruin her father's good name and reputation. I no longer associate with anyone with that last name, including my mother who married into it. It's insane how common this kind of story is. There's a book called The Way We Never Were by Stephanie Coontz. Your comment just reminded me of it, and that I seriously need to read that book. It basically shatters the nostalgia that many folks have about America in the 50s/60s and the romanticized ideal we tend to have of that time as being like a Leave It to Beaver era. It actually was not. Again, haven't read and still need to, but it talks about just how prevalent abuse, domestic violence, rape from husbands, and sexual abuse of children actually were. Thanks for the reminder. I'm picking that book up now. My dad is named Stephen. When he was in his 40s, he was discussing names with my uncle, about 12 years older than my dad. My uncle told my dad he was named after a sibling that died. Apparently my dad had an older brother who died, the first Stephen, who was never discussed when they were children. Thanks for the support on this. I am always saddened by the fact that my grandmother lived with this loss for decades in silence. No one should have to have the pain of losing a child. Naming a child after their late sibling seems creepy nowadays, but it was quite normal back then. That's a very interesting yet frustrating thing to consider when you are into genealogy. My great-grandmother had a first kid, Henri, who passed when he was only a few weeks old. Second kid was named Henri, passed about a month later too. Third Henri died as an adult, which I guessed she would have considered a successful Henri. My uncle gave up his kids for adoption because his new wife didn't like kids. They were school-aged and knew he was their dad. He just straight up abandoned them, and we never met those cousins, and he never talks about them, and most people don't know he had kids. My other uncle has had 3 marriages and because of his infidelity. All of his kids have different moms. And my sister is one of those uncle's best friend's kid and not our dad's. But we're the assholes if we bring it up. My uncle admitted on his deathbed that he kidnapped, tortured, and killed the man who murdered my grandfather. Edit. I feel I need to explain my uncle a little. He was a loving and honest man. He was a steel worker for most of his life and married my aunt right out of high school. My mom made fun of him because she said he was too much of a goody-goody. He never drank, smoked, or ran around on my aunt. But apparently he did kill a man. My uncle has a secret family in Malaysia that he visits every year for 2/3 days when he transits there, and we are South Asian smile. I've always heard that my parents' divorce did not go well, but both my mom and dad were relatively adamant about not telling me till I was 18, which I am now, and still haven't heard the whole story. However, over the years I've heard bits and pieces of what happened because my parents or family members occasionally slipped up. Currently I know that during their marriage my mom was not allowed to have any friends, nor was she able to talk to strangers without getting grief. She generally had to do whatever my dad said unless she wanted an earful. She filed for divorce when I was 2, at which point my dad proceeds to make her life living hell as the court case happened. He tried to get full custody of me, which didn't happen, but he did get a half and half deal. He took my mom's car and somehow had it break down so she couldn't use it. Accused her of multiple crazy things, including prostituting herself while I was there and selling drugs, neither of which are true, and badmouthed her to his family. They didn't believe him, but they also didn't keep contact with my mom because they knew he'd give them hell for it too. He also at no point ever paid child support. I have also been told stories of how I'd write notes to my mom saying I hate her and wanted to go to my dad's house instead. Likely because he would tell me how awful she was and I was young and believed him. I've since apologized and my mom laughed it off and told me she knew I didn't know any better. She has also said that she generally couldn't talk to him for anything and chose not to enforce any of the court mandates, the child support included, because she didn't want to stir anything up again. So yeah, apparently I've been in the middle of what might be the messiest divorce I've ever heard of. Every woman on my mom's side, including her, has been molested by the same man. He's still alive and apparently I've met him. Jesus, how has that not caught up and bit him in the ass yet? My aunt is actually my half-sister. My mom had her in high school and my grandparents legally adopted her as their own. This was shockingly common back in the day. This happened in my husband's family with his gran. His father didn't find out about his aunt until he was in his 60s. I'm related to so many Nazis. My dad slept with my CPS caseworker. On a kinda similar note, my dad slept with his marriage counselor. How does this even happen? Maybe marriage counselors are serial homewreckers. Job security. That I was a test tube baby. The way I found out was that my mom and dad divorced and were fighting for custody back and forth, in order to sway me to tell the courts that I wanted to live with her. My mom told me in the car on the ride home. I was 7, needless to say I didn't give a shit. My mom gave up custody and ran off. As far as I was concerned, he's my dad through and through. I told him years down the line. He was horrified that I found out that way and an awkwardness fell over him. I told him I didn't give a shit about any of that and I loved him, and as far as I was concerned he was the best parent I could have asked for and that he did a stand-up job raising me. The amount of pride in my dad's face is still a very vivid image for me that brings a tear to my eyes just typing this. Cousin was killed by a bear and they never told us. But my sister and I always got yelled at for making jokes about bears killing people and we never knew why. Edit, he was a distant cousin from a remote branch of the family. I'm going to give you guys some context because lots of you seem to be asking. Greater than he died sometime around 1990 and I didn't find out until 10 to 15 years later that he was even dead, let alone that a bear had ripped him to pieces. I'd never met him, or any other of the distant Canadian branch of my family, at that point, so to me it wasn't a huge emotional tragedy in any way. My parents were sort of overprotective when it came to violence and death. Oh no. How'd you find out? World of Warcraft. Shortly after release the game was patched so that harvesting resource nodes would cause nearby mobs to attack, making farming herbs and or a lot harder. But skinning an animal wasn't affected. Someone posted a meme about how skinning a bear should aggro every bears, and my sister and I were running that shit into the ground humor-wise. And our mom started screaming at us again about bears. And finally let slip that a bear killed our cousin, and that's why bear attacks were off the table as far as jokes went.